Hello everyone. Today on CNN Greece, we're going to put our emphasis on data visualization in the coronavirus era. We will be discussing with Alberto Cairo. He's the Knight Chair in Visual Journalism at the School of Communication of the University of Miami, also the Director of the Visualization Program at the university's Center for Computational Science. Dr. Cairo has been consulting with companies and institutions like Google, and has provided training to the European Union and the Eurostat, among others. Now, he's going to help us make sense of the coronavirus graphic information received through the media and how we can distinguish the truth from visual misrepresentations of the data. Professor Cairo, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, Professor, I know every data story is different and we can't simply generalize, but are there any widespread rules that journalists and designers should follow when they make their visualizations in critical times, such as this one?
I would not speak about rules that are set in stone. I would mention principles that we should all be guided by. Such as, for instance, the whole purpose of making a visualization, of designing a graphic, a chart, a map, or a diagram, or an infographic, is not the infographic itself. It's not the graphic itself. The ultimate purpose of designing that is to enable understanding on the part of the reader. So we always need to keep that in mind. And transparency is another very important goal. Therefore, whenever we design a visualization, there are certain principles that may be derived from those ultimate goals. So in terms of transparency, a journalist should always disclose where the data comes from, where the information comes from, and also if any transformations were made to the data, because these transformations, these manipulations often are extremely important, extremely necessary, then the journalist needs to explain those transformations as well. And then on the other hand, on the side of understanding, the journalist should try to make the information as graspable by the reader as possible. And in order to do that, we need to use graphics, types of graphics that our potential audience can understand. And whenever we need to use graphics that we think that a potential audience may not understand, then we need to be prepared to explain them. And the pandemic is a great example of that, because during the pandemic, we have seen types of charts that are slightly unusual for common readers. For instance, line charts that show change over time with scales that are not arithmetic, that are not continuous, right? That we have seen scales that have increments of tens, right? We call those logarithmic scales or non-linear scales. So the scale looks like, instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cases, it's 1, 10, 100, and 1,000 cases. And readers sometimes react to those types of charts, rejecting them, say, oh, this graphic, I don't understand what it is actually showing. So the role of the designer, the role of the journalist should be to explain why we use sometimes those types of scales, which in the case of a pandemic like COVID-19, those types of scales are useful not to show the total number of cases or cumulative number of cases, but how often they multiply by a factor, how many times, how often they duplicate or they multiply by 10. Those are the types of goals that type of a scale may help fulfill. But it is the duty of the designer and the journalist to explain that to readers, not just to show the graphic, but also to be prepared to explain it.
A good example could be the global map from the Johns Hopkins Center and the way it illustrated same size circles for New York and Italy. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why this is problematic from a visualization point of view, and we'll be showing this map.
Yeah, well, I would like to begin by praising the work of Johns Hopkins University and in particular the effort that they have made to put these data in the hands of the public. I believe that is extremely praiseworthy. So we need to begin the discussion about that dashboard saying that's an incredible effort. And also that it is much easier to criticize something than to create it. And there is a lot of work behind that dashboard. I have criticized that dashboard, though. Not the entire dashboard. As I said before, the dashboard is marvelous. I think that is a great effort. But in particular, the map. The map worries me a little bit because of what you just said. Well, it worries me for other reasons. It worries me because it represents the data at different levels of detail, depending on how a country reports the number of cases, and Johns Hopkins, this team gets the data. They may show the data just nationally or regionally. So for example, countries such as Norway and Iceland on the main map, they only have a circle. But if you go to India, Spain, the United States, and Brazil, you have dozens of circles, each one of them representing one region, or in the case of the United States or Brazil, one state. And that creates a visual impression that is a little bit misleading, because Europe and Africa, which also reports data at the national level, apparently, they look very sparse, they look very empty. There's only one circle per country, therefore there's a lot of white space around those circles. The United States is completely covered in red in the first view of the map, and that can be potentially misleading. My recommendation in that map would be to try to represent the data just at the national level in the first view, and then if people zoom in, then split the bubbles up and then show the data at the local level. And then the scales of the circles are also not proportional to each other. So as you said, I mean, the regional level data has one scale and the national level data has a different scale. And that makes the circles not comparable to each other, because the regional ones are actually much bigger than they should be. So all those are aspects that I think that can be potentially misleading to a reader. And if we know that could be potentially misleading to readers, maybe we may want to prevent that and try to design something that might be a little bit better. So as I said, that's the aspect that I would change in that particular dashboard. I don't know why they decided to show the data at multiple levels of geographical distributions. I haven't talked with anybody in that team, but as a reader of graphics myself, that's the first thing that, it made me stop at the very beginning, just because it created those imbalances in their representation. And if it happened to me, someone who is used to reading these types of things on a regular basis, I imagine that it will happen much more often or much more commonly with people who don't have the experience that I have in this particular area. So it worries me a little bit.
Now, what is imperative here is that the information spreading can strongly influence people's behavior and change the effectiveness of the countermeasures deployed by governments. However, given the complexity of the topic, do you think that the best chart would be a simple one or a more complex and descriptive one?
It depends. So so obviously describing the spread of a pandemic, it's a complicated topic with multiple angles that we could cover, because obviously the pandemic is not just the pandemic; it's also all the related factors related to the pandemic, the economic consequences, the impact on people's lives, and all those phenomena can be quantified, and therefore they can also be represented graphically. So the complication of a chart, or better said, the complexity, not necessarily the complication, the complexity of a chart in the sense of the amount of detail that charts could have, needs to be balanced out with the complexity of the story. So if a story is complex, necessarily the representation of that story will be complex as well. We cannot design simplistic charts if the story is quite complex. At the same time, if the story is very straightforward, then the representation of that story, of the data in that story, can be simpler, can be much easier to read or faster to read. So the answer is, it always depends on the story. However, the drive of journalists is always to try to simplify as much as possible, which I believe that it's a noble goal that we should pursue. However, sometimes it leads us to oversimplify things, right? And try to show just averages, and when a distribution is very skewed and we also show an average, for instance, well, that's not a good representation, right? I could go on and on, but the bottom line is that the more complex the topic is, the more complex the representation or the explanation of that topic would be, and it is the task of the journalist. The goal of the journalist should be to try to clarify that story, to try to explain it as well as possible, not necessarily just showing the data, but also try to put the data in context with some sort of narrative that can be built on top of it to clarify the meaning of those numbers that are being presented to readers.
Right. There has never been in the history of humanity so much data shared globally as a public health crisis unfolds. This is truly the first, I would say, data-driven pandemic. But on the other hand, finding reliable information on the virus's toll and other metrics has proven such a challenging task for many journalists around the world. In some places, journalists are still fighting with their governments to access any data at all. Why do you think this keeps happening, and how could a journalist go about overcoming the problem?
I think that it is a very complex challenge that has multiple actors. So access to data. One of the main hurdles that we are facing today is that access to the data might be easy, but the data might be tainted or maybe distorted in some way by the governments who control the data. This has happened in the United States, for example, with the state of Florida, where I live. The governor of Florida tried to hide certain portions of data and then show other portions of data, only the data that made the state look good, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. The challenge that we're facing, I think, in general, this is happening all over the world, is that there is a move in many governments, in many new governments that took over between the 2015, 2016, 2018, a move towards, I would say, authoritarianism in the way that they control the flow of information. So we had cases of illiberal governments, illiberal rulers taking over. So Donald Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and many others, and people who have been in power for quite a while, like Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are all leaders who don't believe in being truthful with the data. They don't care about the truth. They care about things that make them look good. And all the people who are with them, all the people who support this type of government or this type of ruler, they also believe on information not as a means for people to conduct better lives. They believe in information and controlling the flow of information as a means to stay in power. Therefore, that poses a huge challenge to journalists, because institutions that were traditionally tasked with providing reliable information to the public, their work has been controlled, or has been there has been obstacles being put to the work of people who work, for instance, for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. Right, there has been an effort to control that flow of data. So that's a huge challenge. However, this is not a new phenomenon, right? We're dealing with these types of governments and rulers humanity has been dealing with them for forever, essentially, right? All over history. And journalists in countries that were ruled by this type of rulers, this type of governments, they have found ways paths around to try to dodge the controls that governments try to impose on them. I'm thinking about, for example, Argentina, right? Data journalists in Argentina, in places such as a newspaper called La Nación in Argentina, they didn't rely on publicly available sources of data alone. They created their own data. They gathered their own data with the help, for instance, of educational institutions, of other institutions that also care about truth-telling. The Washington Post, for example, in the United States, doesn't use directly COVID-19 data, right? Raw data coming from governmental institutions, right? They process they use that data, but they also use other sources of data, and they merge all those data together in order to come up with their own statistics based on a fair and academic assessment of the quality of those data. They combine all that data in order to come up with a number that they believe is more trustworthy and more accurate than the numbers that are provided by public institutions. So maybe this is the path that journalists all over the world, particularly those who are used to working in a different way, in countries where traditionally governments respected transparency laws and tried to be reliable and trustworthy, well, maybe that situation has deteriorated a little bit in countries such as the United States or Brazil, and some others who are going through hard times in this sense.
Right, and speaking of other sources, We need to say that in Greece, the journalistic non-profit organization IMED supports a wide community of independent media professionals and has created an open source database with COVID-19 data broken down by Greek regions. Dr. Cairo, author of the book How Charts Lie, Getting Smarter About Visual Information. Thank you so much for explaining us thoroughly these critical issues. I think we added at least a touch of smartness when we think about how we ingest data visuals. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me again.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. Stay updated with our online newsfeed and have a nice rest of the day.